For decades, Japan felt predictable, not weak, just settled. A country that had drawn clear lines around itself and built prosperity inside them. Its military existed to hold ground, not to shape outcomes. That assumption became comfortable, and comfort has a way of blinding people to change. What caught everyone off guard wasn't a sudden rearmament. There was no dramatic announcement, no parade meant to signal a break from the past. No moment where Japan declared it was done waiting. Instead, the shift began somewhere far less visible, in how Japan started defining danger itself. The turning point wasn't a weapon system, it was language. In 2022, Japan's leadership accepted something it had avoided since the end of World War II, that waiting to be attacked was no longer a viable way to survive in East Asia. The wording was careful, almost clinical, but the implication was enormous. Japan would no longer limit its planning to absorbing strikes. It would prepare to prevent them. That single change quietly rewired everything. How Japan plans conflict, how it equips its forces, how its neighbors now calculate risk. What makes this moment unsettling isn't speed. Japan isn't racing anyone. It's moving with direction, and direction is far harder to counter than momentum. The pressures driving this aren't hypothetical. Missiles from North Korea now cross Japanese airspace often enough to feel routine. Chinese naval and air patrols operate near Japanese islands as a constant presence rather than an exception. Russian military activity around Japan's northern approaches has intensified alongside Europe's wider security collapse. Japan doesn't have the luxury of distance. Its islands offer no strategic depth. Its economy depends on sea lanes it doesn't control alone. Its population centers sit inside the reach of multiple missile forces. For years, restraint was treated as stability. Now it looks like exposure. What changed wasn't Japan's identity, it was the environment surrounding it. The result is a military transformation that's easy to miss if you're looking for spectacle, but impossible to ignore if you're planning against it. Japan isn't abandoning its post-war framework, it's adapting it to a region that no longer rewards hesitation. That's why this shift feels quiet, and why it matters. Because when a country with Japan's industrial capacity, technological depth, and alliance structure decides it must deter threats before they arrive, the consequences aren't symbolic, they're structural. This isn't a story about aggression. It's about preparation overtaking restraint, and once that balance tips, it almost never tips back. For most of the post-war era, Japan's military power was capped by something far more restrictive than technology or manpower. It was capped by an idea, 1%. That informal ceiling on defense spending shaped everything Japan built, and everything it chose not to build. It wasn't written into law, but it was enforced culturally and politically for decades. Staying under that threshold reassured neighbors, calmed domestic opposition, and reinforced the image of Japan as a state that had permanently stepped away from power politics. Crossing it was never supposed to be easy, and that's why the decision to abandon it matters so much. When Japan committed to raising defense spending toward 2% of GDP by 2027, it wasn't just adjusting a budget line. It was signaling that the strategic environment had become severe enough to override a consensus that had survived generations. That move places Japan on track to field one of the largest defense budgets on the planet, rivaled only by the United States and China in absolute terms. What's important here is not the number itself, it's what the number enables. Japan's military was already technologically sophisticated, but constrained in scale and redundancy. The new funding doesn't create a brand new force. It fills in gaps that planners have worried about quietly for years. Stockpiles that were thin become sustainable. Platforms that existed in limited numbers gain depth. Maintenance cycles become less fragile. Training tempos rise without hollowing out readiness. This is how military power actually grows, not through dramatic announcements, but through durability. The funding increase also removes a long-standing contradiction in Japan's security posture. For years, Tokyo relied heavily on the United States for extended deterrence while lacking the independent capacity to absorb or respond to sustained pressure on its own. That imbalance was tolerable when threats were distant or predictable. It becomes dangerous when multiple actors test boundaries at the same time. By expanding its defense budget, Japan isn't stepping away from the alliance. It's making itself harder to coerce inside it. Washington understands this dynamic well. So do Beijing, Pyongyang, and Moscow. A stronger Japanese military does not weaken the US presence in Asia. It anchors it. It reduces the burden on American forces while increasing the cost of any regional escalation that assumes Japan will remain passive or dependent. This is where the shift becomes uncomfortable for Japan's rivals because it closes off assumptions they have relied on. China can no longer treat Japan as a secondary factor around Taiwan or the East China Sea. North Korea cannot assume missile tests will only provoke statements. Russia cannot treat Japan's northern approaches as strategically quiet while it concentrates elsewhere. Money, in this case, becomes strategic clarity. Japan is funding the ability to stay in a fight longer than anyone expected it would ever need to. It is buying resilience rather than shock value, which is precisely why the change feels understated. But resilience is what decides wars that don't end quickly, and Japan is clearly planning for a region where quick resolutions are no longer realistic. The spending increase is not a burst, it's a commitment. And once a country like Japan commits to sustaining military power at that level, the question stops being whether it can defend itself and starts becoming how far its influence naturally extends. That's where the story gets more complicated. Because money alone doesn't change doctrine, and Japan's doctrine is changing too. That shift begins with missiles. For decades, Japan's military doctrine rested on a careful promise. It would defend itself, it would not strike first, and it would not build the kind of capabilities that suggested otherwise. That promise is now deliberately looser. When Japan released its updated national security strategy in late 2022, the language looked cautious on the surface, legalistic, restrained, very Japanese. But buried inside it was a sentence that would have been politically impossible just a few years earlier. Japan accepted the need for counterstrike capability. That phrase sounds technical, almost boring. It isn't. Counterstrike means the ability to hit enemy bases, launch sites, and command nodes beyond Japan's territory if an attack is judged imminent or already underway. Not intercepting missiles in the air, not absorbing damage and responding diplomatically. Reaching outward and breaking the chain before it completes. This is not a small adjustment, it is a structural shift. Japan isn't rewriting its constitution, it isn't declaring offensive intent. But it is redefining what self-defense looks like in a region where warning times are shrinking and missile salvos move faster than political debate. The logic is blunt. If North Korea can launch from mobile platforms with little notice, waiting to intercept becomes risky. If China can saturate defenses with volume, relying only on shields becomes insufficient. If Russia can threaten Japan's northern approaches while fighting elsewhere, assuming restraint becomes dangerous. Counterstrike capability is how Japan plugs that gap. The most visible symbol of this change is missiles. Not experimental concepts, not distant prototypes, real systems entering inventory. Japan has moved to acquire long-range land attack cruise missiles from the United States while upgrading its own indigenous weapons to reach far beyond previous limits. These systems are intended for deployment on naval platforms first, tying Japan's strike capability to its strongest domain. That choice matters. Japan has always been a maritime power. Its survival depends on sea control, open trade routes, and freedom of movement across choke points. By placing strike weapons on destroyers rather than ground launchers alone, Japan embeds deterrence into the same platforms that already protect its lifelines. This isn't about launching surprise attacks, it's about denial. The message is that any force planning operations against Japan must now factor in risk well before the first missile leaves the rail. Launch sites are no longer immune by default. Rear areas are no longer automatically safe. That changes calculations upstream. What makes this especially unsettling for Japan's neighbors is not the missiles themselves. Plenty of countries have them. It's the combination of precision, targeting intelligence, and discipline that Japan brings to the table. Japan does not build weapons casually. It builds systems. Those systems are designed to work within alliances, share data, integrate sensors, and operate under strict civilian control. That makes them predictable to partners and deeply uncomfortable for adversaries, because predictability does not mean passivity. It means reliability. There is also a longer horizon at work here. Beyond cruise missiles, Japan is investing in advanced glide weapons designed to maneuver at extreme speeds. These programs are framed as defensive counters to regional missile threats, but their implications extend further. They signal that Japan is preparing for environments where interception alone may not be enough. In other words, Japan is planning for the worst-case version of the future, and it's doing so without fanfare. What's crucial to understand is that this doctrinal shift did not happen in isolation. It is paired with changes in how Japan thinks about air power, naval reach, and the spaces between them. Missiles are only useful if you can see, protect, and sustain the platforms that carry them. That brings us to the part of Japan's buildup that has been hiding in plain sight for years: its air and naval forces, and why they already look like something much larger than a self-defense force. Japan didn't wake up one morning and decide to become dangerous. It spent decades becoming capable first. Long before anyone talked about counterstrike or long-range missiles, Japan had already built something most countries never managed to assemble at all: a deeply integrated air-sea force designed for high-end conflict, even while pretending it wasn't. That contradiction is the key to understanding why Japan's shift now feels sudden, even though the groundwork was laid quietly over generations. Start with the air. Japan operates one of the most sophisticated fighter forces outside the United States, not just in terms of aircraft types, but in how those aircraft are trained, maintained, and networked. Its pilots consistently rank among the most experienced in the region, flying high annual hours and training against realistic threat profiles. The introduction of stealth aircraft didn't replace that culture, it layered on top of it. Japan's growing fleet of fifth-generation fighters isn't being treated as a prestige purchase or a symbolic upgrade. They are being woven into a broader architecture that includes early warning aircraft, ground-based radar, space-based sensors, and naval air defense. The result is not just air superiority over Japanese territory, but persistent awareness over surrounding seas. That matters because Japan doesn't fight for land depth. It fights for time. Every extra minute of warning changes the outcome of missile defense. Every extra kilometer of detection shifts where engagement happens. Air power in Japan's doctrine isn't about chasing enemy aircraft. It's about shaping the battle space before the enemy believes the fight has started. Now, look at the sea. Japan's navy is often described as defensive because of its naming conventions and constitutional language. Strip that away, and what remains is one of the most capable surface and undersea fleets in the world. Japanese destroyers are built around air defense, anti-submarine warfare, and command integration. They are optimized to operate as part of a layered shield that stretches far beyond the coastline. Their crews train relentlessly in tracking submarines, intercepting missiles, and coordinating with allied forces across vast distances. This focus didn't come from nowhere. Japan sits astride some of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. Almost everything that keeps its economy alive passes through waters that could be contested in a crisis. Protecting those routes requires more than patrols. It requires dominance in sensing, tracking, and denial. That's why Japan invested so heavily in submarines, quiet ones, long-range ones, crewed by sailors trained for extended operations with minimal margin for error. Japan's undersea force is not designed for global power projection. It is designed to make the surrounding seas profoundly uncomfortable for anyone who doesn't belong there. Submarines don't need to fire to influence behavior. They just need to exist. What makes this air-sea combination so potent is not any single platform. It's how deliberately Japan avoided shortcuts. There was no rush to build massive numbers, no obsession with headline systems at the expense of sustainment. Instead, Japan built depth where it mattered most. Maintenance capacity, crew quality, interoperability, these are boring words that decide wars. When Japan now adds long-range strike capability to this foundation, it isn't starting from zero. It's attaching an offensive option to a force already designed to see first, survive first, and coordinate faster than most of its potential adversaries. That's why the shift feels alarming to some observers. The hardware didn't suddenly appear. The permission to use it differently did. And because Japan's military culture prizes discipline over spectacle, these changes arrive without parades or dramatic announcements. They show up in budget documents, training schedules, and basing decisions that don't trend on social media. But adversaries notice, especially when those adversaries already face pressure elsewhere. China watches Japan's air and naval integration with increasing unease, particularly around Taiwan and the East China Sea. North Korea sees a shrinking window between launch and response. Russia, distracted and stretched, now has to account for a northern neighbor that no longer treats distance as protection. Japan hasn't declared itself a superpower. It hasn't needed to. It already had the skeleton of one. What's changed is that Japan is now adding muscles it once refused to acknowledge. And that raises the most important question of all. Not what Japan is building, but how far it's willing to go once the moment arrives where restraint no longer feels safe.